puzzles and mopping the whole, I just sat here.
Oh, that's right.
Making the costumes. They're very worried about them, and I want to go forward. I know many of you do. So we've decided to wait just a half an hour. It's a different story every channel you pick. So it's very difficult to know which way
Do they
it's going.
understand we would do it without the petticoats?
Yes, I said we'd pay for everything that was damaged or whatever, and they volunteered to make them.
John McCullen, he was settled in Rockford, Illinois, with his family, with his wife, and then he hired an Englishman who was by the name of James, and they decided to move westward to find a new homestead for the family because his wife was expecting a child, which was Margaret. So in 1852, they set out westward, and where they built a log cabin on the banks of Lime Creek. So on the banks of Lime Creek, they built a cabin which was 14 by 16 feet long, and when it was finished, John left James to watch over the place for him while he went back to gather his family. Now, with the birth of Margaret, things kind of obviously slowed down for a while, and then they traveled to the new homestead in what was not Mason City, Iowa, what would be Mason City. And so they traveled, and Margaret was 6 months old when they arrived, and they were basically in the heart of Indian territory. They were surrounded by the Winnebago and the more violent Indian tribe, the Sioux. Now, they were in the midst of an Indian war during that time, so their family was constantly on guard, and Margaret remembers her father telling her when she was 3 years old there was a big Indian war about 2 miles north of where they were on the banks, and it was just very, very bad. So the town basically grew from their little place. Margaret's family, her father started a little marketplace, if you want to call it, a general store where he had items to sell, and eventually the house that they owned started off as a little bit of a church/courtroom for the people to meet. Now, as the time grew on, they built a bigger place, which expanded their general store, which was farther down the road, and so therefore they created they created the town. And then it wasn't until later in her life that Margaret remembers meeting a boy by the name of Clinton, who was in the town visiting his mother and sister when they met, and then soon they were to be wed at the Methodist Church, which was shockingly delayed because the fact of a prowling wolf happened to walk in the middle of the ceremony. So, needless to say, her father had to shoot it. So that was how they were wed, and it was a very, very extravagant wedding. Her father had grown wealthy throughout the process of making up the store and selling of wares, especially to the local Indian tribes, which eventually settled down and moved. And so then her father, later in life, he became the police chief of justice, and Margaret moved with her husband, where she then had 2 children, and they settled down with their life, and she was later in her life interviewed to be the first white child in the area to have settled with her family. And this was a big deal back then because they moved into a wilderness area that had not been settled. There were no towns. They're basically out in the middle of nowhere except a couple other houses. So this was big. This made like national headline news. Her and her family were interviewed, and it was a big deal back then. And the fact that, well, she was the first white child was huge. So then after she passed away, she eventually, her children moved on. But here's the fact is that she was buried here in Mason City, and you can see her family was buried here as well. So on the banks of Lime Creek, you can still possibly see the remnants. I don't know, are they still there? He knows.
The brewery?
It's right across from the brewery. Not across from the brewery?
By the nature center?
No, it's not still there. It's not still there. Okay, I had to check. Our magic man back there has looked up all these facts on this, and it's really fun. And personally, myself, I really enjoyed getting to know the roles of women during this time, because it was very surprising that, we can't think of it now as being the first white folks to settle in an area because, we're kind of here. So, but that's basically the story of Margaret Ann Shipley. She was a dutiful housewife, and she stayed basically to what it was, the roles of a wife was, you know, not like they are today. It was basically the cooking, the crib, and managing the house and raising the children, which is unlike to what we are used to today. Wives are used to, you know, basically having a lot of freedom. She did not have that. So, anybody have any questions or comments, concerns? Yeah.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
Thank you. To come today. In my 94 years of living, have I seen some changes around here. I am Corey Curry, and I was born in 1847 in Toronto, Canada. I lived there until I was 18, where I moved to another town in Canada, worked in a general store. Do you see something that might be coming in my general store experience? And I worked in the National Guard. I decided to visit my relatives in Wisconsin, and after visiting them, that the United States was the place to live. So I took off, lived in Wisconsin, and now I was a teacher. I think I had a lot of talents I didn't know about. I was a teacher for 2 years. While I was in Wisconsin, I met my wife, Louisa, who is buried here beside me. We were married, and I took off for Iowa for a year without her. I began to homestead in an area not too far from Titonka, Iowa. I got the homestead ready, built the house, and I went back and got my wife. And we came by horse and buggy, covered wagon from Wisconsin, passing through Mason City, not realizing that that is where I would eventually end up. We homesteaded in Titonka for 9 years. Life on the prairie is great. It's beautiful. The grasses are wonderful, the native flowers, the animals, everything is wonderful. There are a few things that happened to go wrong while we were there. Our first year there, we did have the locusts come through, or the grasshopper year as they called it, and they ate everything in their path. The other thing that affected us from time to time were those prairie fires. A single bolt of lightning could just destroy a whole area. After 9 years of living there, which were wonderful, we did have our 3 children while we lived there, we moved to Mason City. And in Mason City, I worked for the railroad. The railroad had come to Mason City in 1869, affording young men wonderful jobs. I luckily was hired as a fireman and an engineer on the railroad. So I worked for the railroad for 3 years. Well, then I decided it was time to open up a restaurant. So I opened up a restaurant on North Main Street, which is now, you know, as North Federal, not too far from, if you remember back a ways, where a Nichols and Green shoe store used to be. So I opened my restaurant there, ran it for 8 years, and saw that the future was not for me in the restaurant business, but going back to my general store upbringing, I went into the hardware business. Luckily, my son Frank wanted to join me, and we were a team for many years. In 1921, I took on another partner who was an employee. His name was Mr. Van Ness. So some of you might remember the Curry Van Ness hardware store. I have a little memento here of that. And that existed, well, actually that's still in existence because this is 1942 and I'm not quite dead yet. Some of the impressions that I had of Mason City when I first came are very different than as it is now in my 94th year of living. When I arrived, all the streets were dirt. Sidewalks were simply planks that were put down in the road. From my location at my restaurant and then my hardware store, I could look right across the park and see the courthouse. It was a small building that's erected where you would find Wells Fargo today. The First National Bank building did not exist yet, and it was just covered in trees. A few people were quite industrious. There was a small lime kiln that was in existence in the northeast part of town, and also there was the beginnings of brick making. Little did I know when I first opened my hardware store how important those industries would be to Mason City. So the hardware store continued, and if I could look into the future, if I could have that privilege, I would see now that not only did my son join me in the business, but his son did. And his son's name was Richard Curry. And Richard's son, which would be my great-grandson, is still continuing in an offshoot of Curry's Hardware. Curry's Hardware broke off in 1958 and started into hollow metal doors and frames. And so that is still what is left of the Curry's Hardware, original hardware store that I started in 1892. So not too long ago, it was 100 years of Curry's Hardware. I'm delighted that you came by today, and I'm hoping that if you would like to take a look at some posters of some washing machines that I used to sell in my hardware store, you're welcome to take a look at those before proceeding on. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. That was very good.
What's that? We'll try to warm you with our stories. Don't be afraid of the ghosts now. My name is Edward R. Bogardus, and during my long life of 77 years, I saw lots of changes, both to the world as a whole and to Mason City in North Iowa. Just think of what it was like for a young fellow of 9 years old to come from Illinois to North Iowa in a covered horse-drawn wagon. And yet, near the end of my life, a year before I died, Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic in an airplane. So it was a very busy time and a lot going on. My mother was Maria Vermilia Bogardus. Vermilia might sound familiar to some of you if you know about Mason City. And she and my father moved from New York to the Chicago, Illinois area in 1848. In 1850 I was born. In 1851 my father died. And later, when I was 9 years old, I came with my uncle George Vermilia to Mason City in that covered wagon. A lot has changed over that time, and architecture and transportation among those. First, we lived in Rock Falls. It wasn't a town then, but it was a little community. And I had to walk over 2 miles to get to school, but I did it. In a few years, we moved to Mason City, fairly new community. And I went to school in a 2-story stone school that was fairly new. And it was also, beside from being a school, was a meeting place for all kinds of community meetings. Even churches, because there was no church at that point in time. It took the place of Macmillan's General Store as a meeting place. That, prior to that, was where one would go to have a meeting. Oh, I'm getting older. So after I was done with school, I worked as a printer for A.T. Parker. And by the way, you'll meet him a little later, right over here. And then I worked for my uncle George Vermilia, who had a large lumber establishment. And we sold lumber and did some construction and so forth. One of the interesting things was that there was no railroad through here at the time, so all our supplies had to come by wagon. And I spent a little time on the road, and our lumber, certain kinds of lumber, had to come from the river. That's the Mississippi River. And we'd have to go and, with a wagon, pick up a load of lumber and then come across some pretty treacherous trails coming to Mason City. And there were times when I had to stop the wagon and unload it because it was stuck in the mud. Move ahead a little bit and then reload all that lumber onto the wagon and go ahead again. And that might happen several times during one trip. So the life of a drayman was not the most friendly of businesses at that point in time. Through the lumber business, I got to know the construction game and worked in construction, and am best known for being an architect. and didn't go to school for architecture, but learned it through practical means. And there are a number of large projects that may be familiar to you. Of course, much of what I produced in my career from 1870s to 1920s is gone now. A lot of buildings torn down, but some are familiar to you. The Decker House, which I understand is now a bed and breakfast. There's two homes that are on either side of the footbridge that goes across the creek. The Markley House and the Rule House, they're still there and very beautiful homes. Also some homes on State Street. My Uncle George Vermilia's house, which is a very prominent house and been added to many times, and the Longnecker House, which is right at the entrance to East Park. So I was a busy fellow for quite a while. I married Mary Randall, who was the daughter of Elisha Randall, in 1874, and we had 5 children. One of those, Raymond, joined my business as an architect. Mason City homes changed a lot during the time that I was here. The ones that I built were really quite grand. But when we first moved to town, we lived in a very small home, and the only heat was the heat of a cook stove. And even that would be allowed to die out in the evening, and because we were afraid of fires. So you can imagine waking up and sleeping in a side room of that house, no plaster on the wall, and you were able to look out and see light outside through the clapboards on the wall. Very cold. And we enjoyed staying in bed until someone lit the stove. So it was not a fine time, but it was an interesting time to live in Mason City. When the railroad came through in 1869, things improved greatly. And that made a big difference for Mason City, having the railroad come through this area. Some other things, I mentioned that the school was used as a church. Well, in 1864, a group got together and built a church, a new stone church. And that church is still standing as part of the First Congregational Church. There's an old stone portion of it that is on one side. The rest of the church was built in the 1889, I believe. So it's interesting. I know you all have lived through some interesting times as well. So I appreciate you coming, and have a good tour, and I hope you enjoy the stories that people tell here.
Good afternoon. Hi. Thanks for coming. I'm sorry the weather didn't cooperate, but it's nice to see so many of you out here, brave souls. My name is Ella Klidgett. I was born Ella Brightman in Saskatchewan, New York, in 1855. I moved to Mason City, Iowa with my family when I was 16 years old. Oh, what an adventure. Can you imagine anytime you move as a teenager, but to come clear to Iowa from New York, which would have been quite different. Have you noticed that many of the early settlers in the Iowa Territory did come from New York? I graduated from Mason City High School and then was lucky enough to pursue my education in music, which was my passion, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I met my husband, John, through civics. We were both very civic-minded. He was a prominent attorney in town and 15 years older than I, but we got along famously. He was also actually the mayor of Mason City from 1880 to 1884. His many travels and clients allowed me to throw some wonderful parties. I loved entertaining and prided myself on being a great hostess. I was a charter member of the Midland Group, which was basically a social group for women, but we promoted reading in town. By 1919, we had 50 members. What an accomplishment, all from this community. One of the highlights of my life was in 1884. We were able to attend the Democratic National Convention in Chicago and voted for Grover Cleveland. And he did become the Democratic nominee and then became president. Some trivia on Grover Cleveland. He bought the first baby carriage for sale for a young couple, his friends. 41 years later, he married that girl. He was much older than his wife, but they were married for a long time and had 5 children. They were married when she was 21 years old. I was charter member of the Elmwood Ladies Association, Elmwood Cemetery Ladies Association, and we wanted to beautify this area for all to enjoy. After the railroad came through, many graves had to be moved to make room for the railroad. And so that's why we wanted to make it a nice, beautiful place for everyone to be able to come and enjoy, and it's certainly become that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good.
I'm Allenson Townsend Parker, but more commonly known in Mason City and the Cerro Gordo County area as A.T. Parker. Have any of you ever been to Parker's Woods on the west side of town? Yes? Oh, yeah. Well, yes, it was named for me. You see, I was born in Frankfort, New York, and after getting an education there, I'd begun to hear about westernization. And I came to Mason City in 1870 following my cousin, Horace Parker. You see, when Horace was here, he had built a grist and flour mill out on Willow Creek, which is where the prairie-style homes of Rock Glen are located now. You see, I decided to go into business with him, and we ran that mill for about 25 years. And it was an excellent 25 years. You see, during this time, Horace and I had built the Parker Opera House, which still stands today on the corner of 1st Street Northeast and Federal Avenue. I ran the first floor of this opera house as sort of a grocery convenience store for about 10 years. And after 10 years, I sort of sold out to pursue a career in Western development. And that development later became known as Forest Park. How many of you know Forest Park? Yes? Yes. Well, that development also was called A.T. Parker Development. See, selling out of the grocery business wouldn't have been as bad if I didn't get to spend much time with my wife. But she died when she was 33, and she left me alone with my daughter, whom I married. I spent the rest of my life with. I died in 1926. But I lived a fruitful life. I accomplished a lot, and I brought a lot to the West. Brought a lot to Mason City. Anyway, that's just a little bit about myself, and I hope you all enjoyed a little bit. And I hope you're enjoying this weather today. Definitely agreeing. Have a good rest of the tour.
Mason Cityans here today. From way back in 1802 I was born. My name is George Brentner, and I'm very excited to tell you my story. It all started back in Worms, Germany. As I said, I was born there. Lost my accent, but born in 1802. Now, if you don't know where that is, it's if you're Lutheran, they have the Diet of the Worms. I don't know if you're actually eating worms, though. It's not like that. But it's a little history there for you. But anyways, I grew up a normal German childhood. Any other happy German boy could tell you. And I get up there to about age 13, and that's where you got to figure out what you're doing. And the dad knows what's going on. So my dad said, this boy, he's going to be a tailor, talking about me. Now, you look at my clothes here. I'm not a tailor. I wanted to be a carpenter. So, I had to pursue my dreams, so I ran away. And ended up stowing a ship off of Germany. And at the age of 13, I was in Virginia on my own with no money, just living. Well, things were rough back then, but I ended up finding a pretty good woman there. Her name was Julia Prince. And we got married when I was 26 years old. And you may not tell now, my older years, but in my younger days, I was quite a good-looking fella. And me and Julia were pretty good-looking couple. But anyways, this is Julia's marker here. And she's also got a writing on here too. I can't find my name anywhere. It must have rubbed off. And this is, they actually placed down my son here, George W. Brentner, same name as me. I was obviously born a little before him though. So, only about 20 years. So anyways, after we settled down, me and Julia, about 9 years in Virginia we spent there, we decided to hit the road. So we headed to the Midwest. We came over here, settled in Illinois for a while, but we just kept hopping around. It's tough to make ends meet, especially when you got 7 kids, which is how many we ended up having. That's why we gave her the big one. She deserved it. So then after the 7 kids, about 1849, we came on to something big. Does anyone know what happened in 1849?
Gold rush.
The gold rush. Yep. Went out there. We lived like slums out there, but we finally got a little bit of money. We like North Iowa, the marshland up here, so we came back up here and built a settlement called Sebelith. It was the east side of Mason City, so we were on the east side. John Long built this stuff he had a settlement called Masonic Grove on the west side. So we just, 1856, we put it all together, and that's where Mason City began. It wasn't called Mason City right away. We hoped it would become a city. But to start the town off, using my carpentry skills, I built a few buildings, about 6. My house, actually, if you want to know where I lived back in the day, it was up on the north end of Lime Creek, actually near East Park, around that area. And it was next to the McMillan residence. So I lived over there, and we actually, I was thinking from the beginning, I want this to become a good forward-thinking city, you know. So I invited Alicia Rolfe to come in and build a sawmill on the Winnebago River. And I started investing in railroads too. At this time, railroads were a little newer, but I figured, heck, let's get some railroads in Mason City, help it grow into a bigger town, you know. So that's where that came from. I gotta pull out my notes here. Yeah, and after all that, the buying of the land, the sharing with John Long, I started donating it away. You know, I didn't need all that land. So I donated some to the Central Park there. That was a George Brentner donation there. And I donated a lot to Paul Felt, and he did good things with the land. And then I kind of retired to farming. And I died in my boots, and that's where I am today. So, lived a good life, long life. All my kids except one outlived me. The one died at a very young age. So I was blessed, you know, with a strong family. And that's George Brentner for you. Hey, thank you for coming to the cemetery walk this evening. Have a great evening. I don't know where the bus is. It's over there waiting for you.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank you.
sorry, but let everybody qualify that we're at the graveside of Margaret Ann Hickey right now. And her father got was married at the time, and he decided to move westward to expand and hopefully to prosper with the prospects of starting a general store in a new area, a new life. So we traveled from Rockford, Illinois, and moved to an area off of Lime Creek. So he settled there with the help of English immigrant named James. They built a log cabin which was about 14 to 16 feet, and that is where he decided to settle with his family. So after a period of time when it was finally built, John made his way back to pick up his wife and newly born child, and the wife, fearing for the life of the child, decided to probably wanted to wait for the child to get a little bit older, but obviously the husband probably being a little impatient after 6 months decided, hey, we're going, let's go. So in 1853, 6 months after Margaret was born, they decided to move into the log cabin. So So the log cabin at this time was surrounded by the Winnebago Indian tribe and the Sioux Indian tribe. And when she was a young girl, she remembers her father telling her about the great wars with the Indians which occurred, and there was one that had a war as many as 15,000 Indians going up against one another and fighting. Tribe rivalries essentially is going on during this time. So during this time, her father built a general store which he sold things that he had collected during the time before they traveled over to New Homestead. And so the father was selling just little bits and pieces out of the general store, which was Bunny House. And so the town grew and started to prosper. And eventually over time, John decided to create another store, and he built a bigger log cabin, which was 16 feet by 16 feet, a whole 2 feet bigger, and decided to attach it and make it a general store as well as the house. So that is where they lived. They lived basically in the general store, and the family prospered as Margaret, aka Maggie, as she was called by her family. When got older, her father eventually became